HistoryNet and Mr. Brass are interviewing medieval scholar Rachel Fulton Brown. Introduce yourself.
Introduce myself.
Yeah.
Me.
You.
Okay. I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown. I teach at the University of Chicago. I've taught there since 1994. I've written a couple of books on devotion to Christ and the Virgin Mary, and I teach a very wide range of courses in medialization. Anything else?
That's good. I was wondering what got you into that particular sort of field.
You never ask a scholar that unless you want like several hours worth of answers. So, which version of you do you want? That I spent third grade in Albuquerque, New Mexico, convinced that there was a castle on top of the mountain, outside of like Sandia Peak behind where our playground was. That I went to Europe in high school with a school trip. Some of the teachers took us on, and we went to Chartres Cathedral, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. So I wanted to know more about it. I had a very good Latin teacher in high school. So when I got to college, I carried on with my language, and I did classical Latin. But there was also a course in medieval Latin, and I started getting interested in, studying more both about medieval history, and I also had very good classes in the study of the Bible, the New Testament, Jesus in history. And my work in medieval history is actually, it's like combining all of those different interests, right? It's obviously wanting to understand the history and having a kind of fantasy version that Americans tend to be drawn to, knights and shining armor and stuff. I also read Tolkien when I was 11, so that became part of it. That I was fascinated by the Gothic architecture when I saw it for the first time. I grew up in the Southwest and in Texas, Kentucky. I'd never seen anything like a Gothic cathedral. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And because I'm Christian, I was very interested in the history of Christianity, and medieval history seemed to me, for reasons that I can tell you in retrospect were right, but at the time were more like intimations of possibility, that if I wanted to understand Christianity, I needed to understand the Middle Ages.
Like, you wrote a book on the Virgin Mary, I recall. How she was understood in the Middle Ages.
Two of them, 2 books.
Like, are you Catholic? Tell us about that.
Well, I am now. I grew up Presbyterian. I was baptized growing up Presbyterian, and I spent most of the time in graduate school, and then for many years here in Chicago, attending Episcopal churches, so Anglican Church. But in all of that time, I was doing my work on the devotion to Mary, on the medieval reading of Scripture, on the liturgy, on prayer. And when I finished I think maybe you're asking about the second book that I just finished, Mary and the Art of Prayer. When I finished that book, I had gotten myself so deeply into the understanding of Mary and Christ that medieval Christians had, I realized I couldn't stay out of that tradition any longer in my own worship. So I was received into the Catholic Church 2 years ago.
Give us a summary of your books.
So From Judgment to Passion is the first one, and it's a study of prayer to Christ and the Virgin Mary. Its research focus was on commentaries on the Song of Songs, in which the bride and the bridegroom are read as Mary and Christ. So the sort of love song between Mary and her son. But I had to make sense of those. I had to put them in the context of the liturgical developments, the way in which these texts are used in the song of the church, in the long arc of development of devotion to Christ and his humanity, and in the context of the way in which Mary is understood as being the model for the Christian devotee in responding to Christ in his suffering, in his humanity, right? So that's the from judgment to passion is the arc of that argument. Mary and the Art of Prayer is the more recent book that I just finished a few years ago, and it's on the Office of the Virgin Mary, which is a prayer practice that everyone in medieval Europe who could read would have known, because they used that practice as their primer in learning to read, right? And many people were motivated to want to learn to read in order to say this Office of the Virgin Mary. It's focused, my first book was focused on the Song of Songs. The second book is focused on Psalms are used to give an idea both of, who the Virgin Mary is, but in the way in which these Psalms are chosen, it's also through praising her, understanding who God is. So what I say is she, the office itself is a way of showing the way in which she frames God, in which she becomes the place where God becomes present.
Interesting. Like what is it about what was that?
I was going to say that's good. I recall on your discussion with Missing the Mark on nostalgia, where you actually went over the differences between magic and prayer. I actually thought that was pretty interesting, because very much online, there's a lot of people that say that there's really no difference between a miracle and magic. I was wondering what your take was on that.
Well, so that difference between magic and prayer has been something I've been thinking about a lot, because Mary and the Art of Prayer it started as an exercise in what's the experience of prayer like. So I gave you my introduction of myself as a scholar, but I'm also a competitive fencer, a sport fencer, and a very beginning fiddler, although I seem to have been doing it forever. That I'm very drawn to learning practices, and I seem to be also drawn to learning very difficult practices, things that take you a decade to become at all proficient at. And I was interested in studying the medieval practice of saying the Psalms from a similar perspective, that the people who were expert at saying those prayers were monks and nuns, right? And they say the cycle of Psalms, the full cycle of Psalms once a week if they're Benedictines. These were texts they knew by heart, so that their entire imagination is shaped by the phrases of these texts that they're used to singing day after day after day. And one of the things that scholars in the field tend to say is we can't really explain what that practice was like, right? Because you'd be so immersed in it that you would not, to a certain extent, they're so immersed in it that they never describe it in text, right? Almost nobody in the Middle Ages gives us any description of what they felt like when they were praying, which is the kind of thing that modern people tend to want to know. They think of religion as something you experience primarily, and so they want to, have a sense that prayer is spontaneous and effusive and rapturous and things like that. And they see these practices that are basically repeating the same text over and over and over again. And either they assume it's a kind of hypnotic exercise or a kind of mantra that you sort of empty yourself with, or they just assume it's boring, right? So it's something that's so technical. Who would ever feel anything practicing it? Well, I think both of those are wrong. I think that what we know from the descriptions of the descriptions that we have of medieval prayer, they were very concerned about making it purposeful and intentional, so that you understand the text that you're saying and you focus on them. And I did a paper a while ago on a little device that a late 15th century canon, don't worry about what that is, it's like a monk but not quite, developed for keying the responses he was having to the Psalms to his hand, right? It's the article that I did is called My Psalter Myself, and I can't remember what my subtitle was, an exercise for training the intention in prayer. And the reason that he needed this practice was because otherwise he wouldn't be able to attend to the text properly, right? So that suggests something radically different from just saying a phrase that empties itself, right? Like a mantra. But likewise, people worrying about understanding the text and having some kind of intentional devotion and saying them goes against the modern expectation that these are just boring practices that you'd want to run away from as quickly as you could. So the exercise in Marrying the Art of Prayer was finding a way of, as a modern person, sort of imagining yourself into that practice. How could you get inside what it's like for a medieval Christian to pray the Hours of the Virgin? And and what I hope in the way I wrote the book is that it helps people sort of imagine themselves into that. You guys still there?
Yeah, we're still here.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what you what you get to is this sense that prayer shapes your imagination. It shapes your understanding. It shapes your attention. It's a kind of, I mean, one way Simon Weil is a great mystic who in the 20th century described, all study as a way of sort of training Christians in prayer, because it's training the attention. It's training you to let yourself be absorbed in something that isn't about you, right? It's like prayer is about speaking to God. It's about describing the divine, about with the Psalms, it's about using the language of the scriptures to describe the Lord. That is very different from magic, because magic is wanting to make stuff happen, right? It's like if you say a prayer, you are focusing yourself onto God and leaving yourself attentive to God. Magic is always about wanting to term for it, because particularly in medieval magic, it's often angel magic, right? Which means a demon, because you're not going to conjure a good angel. Summoning, commanding, binding, and forcing a particular outcome, which is exactly what you do not do in prayer, right? You pray and then let it be God's will, whether it's fulfilled or not. Magic, you want to make the outcome certain, right? So you want to actually control things. And if you want, the sort of extremely powerful, the most powerful image that we have in modern literature for how deadly that is to want to control, it's Tolkien. It's in the Lord of the Rings, right? The ring, the power of the ring is to control other people's wills. So it's magic in the sense that it is, once you claim it, as Frodo does at the end of the story, to coerce others. And that's what magic wants to do. Magic wants to coerce. Prayer does not. And so worrying about whether or not prayer works is worrying about it as if it should be magic, which is demonic.
But haven't you heard that praying is just haven't you heard that praying is just asking God for something and treating God like a wish fairy and having it granted right then and there?
Well, those are people who don't understand prayer or God.
Yeah, I always just found that sort of funny, where they just think God's like some sort of genie that they can just they just simply rub their hands together. God will just somewhat pop out and grant their wishes.
Well, and people are constantly tempted by that, right? We know in antiquity that people wanted to make sure that this for ancient Christians is often the most powerful difference between Christians and pagans, that in pagan worship, you do the sacrifices perfectly, hopefully, because only if you do it perfectly will, it please the gods, but it's a coercive concern, right? And in Roman pagan sacrifices, if they made a mistake, they'd have to start over, right? Christians recognize that, even in, performing the mass or making the celebration of the sacrifice, there's provision for human frailty always, right? Because it's God that's working through the sacraments. It's not you doing it all perfectly so as to coerce the divine. It's literally the opposite.
Yeah, I remember one other funny thing that we get from the Middle Ages is this idea that everyone was like stupid because they believed in prayer over going to actual experts, like actual doctors. And that's what made the plague so bad.
No, that's just stupid. And that is unfortunately a version of, it's a caricature of the Middle Ages that we get from the Enlightenment. So this is sort of challenging for, whoever counts as conservatives or whatever anybody is anymore. If you're sort of looking to the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason to save modernity, you're looking in the wrong place. Because one of the things that the Enlightenment does is they make a god of reason, right? And in fact, in the French Revolution, that happened explicitly, right? That they develop a cult of reason, and in doing that, they created a caricature of both, their opponents at the time, the church, and therefore the history of the entire church. So that the sort of fantasy version of, oh yes, in the Middle Ages nobody cared about reason. No, that's literally the opposite. That the universities are founded and developed, and Aquinas's great exercise is reasoning through all sorts of difficulties in the faith. And you don't, if you've ever tried to read Aquinas, you cannot pretend that he's not all about reason.
Oh, but haven't you heard Aquinas has been debunked by edgy atheist YouTubers?
Well, he can't be, because they're not thinking through all of his questions. But you had the reason the reason that Europe even survives the plague is that at the time, right? And there's an excellent source collection edited by Rosemary Horrocks called The Black Death, if you actually want all of these details. There's the most important earliest account of plague hitting is by Gabriel de Mussis. He's an Italian, and he's describing how people in 1347-48 understood where the plague come from. And first, they know perfectly well that it was a disease transmitted through contact with they don't have quite the idea of infection that we do, but they understood that the Genoese got the plague because they were being besieged at Kaffa by the Mongols, and the Mongols were suffering from the plague, and they catapulted dead bodies into the besieged city. And when the Genoese fled, they carried the plague with them, right? So it came from contact in the Black Sea with the people from Asia. They also knew, the Europeans all knew, that the plague hit everywhere, right? It devastated China just as badly as it did Europe. So if you're going to be making some kind of claim that, medieval medicine was so terrible, you'd have to say the entirety of Eurasia had no medicine. And the other version of woke historiography is, but the Chinese, of course, had better medicine than Europeans, and nobody had good enough medicine to deal with the bubonic plague.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Justinian plague.
It's exactly the same. There's a lot of work that Michael McCormick did on how the Justinianic plague was the bubonic plague, and is probably, historians hate being definite about causes anymore, but was probably part of the reason that everything was so unsettled in the 7th century, because so many people had died. And therefore, when Islam makes its great expansion in the 7th century, it does so in a context in which there's fewer people to deal with it. But in the 14th century, when the plague hits, they're perfectly well aware that it's how it got to Europe, that it's hit all of the known world as far as they were concerned. They have various natural theories about how they thought it came from maybe earthquakes, which made sense in the sense, if you understand the way humors work and the way the atmosphere works. They also have various astrological explanations, which in their terms are completely natural, right? It's like the movement of the planets. They also have ideas about the humors and so forth. The first generation of doctors is all trying to figure it out medically, but there's also a theological argument saying this is for our sins. And what modern caricatures always assume, it's like, well, if they had a theological or divine argument, they didn't use a natural argument. It's like, no, they did all of it. We're the ones that are blinded and nonsensical because we only accept materialist arguments.
Well, I mean, just remember this. It was obviously because the Jews poisoned the wells.
Well, and the Pope at the time said, absolutely not. Don't. That there's a very important bull that the Pope promulgates in it's in 1349, 1350 thereabouts, saying it's not the Jews, they're dying too.
Well, yeah, I mean, because there was, I remember, a problem going around with that, because I mean, if you ever look at many of the major conflicts between Christians and Jews, you always tend to notice a pattern where where Jews are always in a higher up position, like they're gaining power in some way, and so they're getting some sort of wealth. And then when something bad happens, let's say the plague, or say, I don't know, like the Inquisitions or something like that. Although that didn't
You're
apply.
just skipping around on all this stuff. You want me to debunk every single myth in one episode?
Oh no, I mean it's fine. Like I was just saying, it was funny that they were doing all this, and you noticed a pattern where it was, for one, it was religious and partly, but it was also the fact that Jews just tend to be wealthier, and that made the poor people very angry because they were noticing that these richer people that didn't share their customs were not being affected as much as they were.
You know, it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, and this is why you don't go to atheist activists for history lessons.
Oh my gosh!
They will misinform you. Like at best, they will give you half truths, and at worst, they will make you stupid.
Yes, and the thing, I mean, one of the very complicated things in thinking about the relations between Christians and Jews in the Middle Ages is that there are Jews in medieval Europe is because the kings in the church are protecting them, right? So, I mean, you're saying that they have wealth or influence, but I mean, one of the reasons that they're marked out as distinct is because it's like in England, for example, that the Jewish communities come over with the Normans, and they have particular quarters in the towns. They are directly under the king, right? And that's why in 1290 they can be expelled, because they were in fact legally directly under the king. That in other regions they obviously have special quarters in the town. So you can say it always, these things typically go both ways, right? They're both protected and marked out as distinct, and that creates social tensions.
Like I like the way you presented the caricature of the so-called Dark Ages on your blog. Like the New Atheist fairy tale of history goes something like this. Once upon a time, there were these great enlightened Greeks and Romans. Then Christianity took over the Roman Empire and destroyed all knowledge, and learning ceased by Europe. And it ceased as Europe plunged into the Dark Ages, where life generally sucked for everybody, until the Renaissance came 1,000 years later, and then the Enlightenment, when the big bad church no longer had any power.
Yeah, that's the usual one. But I mean, but obviously you recognize it's an anti-Catholic argument fundamentally. So some parts of it develop in the 16th century with the Protestants, who
right,
in their own polemic are insisting that the church is not allowing the laity to read the scriptures. Well, I mean, one of the things that I show in my new book, My Mary and the Art of Prayer, is yes, people are reading the scriptures, they're reading them for prayer, right? And nobody really sat down just with the Bible and read it from cover to cover, like I guess 19th century Protestants thought they ought to. They read it for different purposes. And the text everybody knew was the Psalms, because that is the core of the worship, right? That's the core of the liturgy. It's the divine office. And the text that I'm talking about in Mary and the Art of Prayer, these are texts laid. So, and the other thing that the Protestant argument suggests is, the preaching is not good enough. Well, you always have to be wary of these kinds of like professional debates, right? It's like, I can say my colleagues in academia now, they don't know nothing, they don't talk about anything real, they don't say anything. Well, that's not entirely true, right? They obviously are, highly skilled and trained and think, complex and difficult thoughts. I disagree with them, right? But if you take my blog as the only, it's a polemic, obviously, because I do have a particular perspective on what the better version of things would be, and that is, that's the way.
The real history is so much more interesting than the bullshit.
So I mean, one of the things I've been trying to do in the blog, and then I have a new course that I just started doing video lectures for. That's Medieval History 101, the unauthorized version. And I have a website for a blog for that's unauthorized, medieval history blogspot.com. And I talk about how one of the things I want to do in the course is talk through a number of these sort of myths that have built up around our ability to understand how complicated the Middle Ages actually were.
I know. I remember what's funny is like I go over the Crusades with some people, and it's like they'll bring up and say, "Oh, religion bad, everything bad." Like they'll say, "Can you tell me the first thing? Like, tell me the year of what the Crusades happened." And you just get like, deer in a headlight sort of look. They don't know anything outside of like what they've been like characters.
1096, folks. Come on.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, I mean, so it's obviously they're working with the mythology of the past. It's like a reverse nostalgia, I suppose, right? That they're working with a mythology that insulates them from the need to understand how complicated the situation was.
I was wondering, like, didn't like the term mythology, like before it became sort of a pejorative, wasn't it just more like of a, like, I still believe like in academia where it's more of just a genre than it is like just saying it's something is false?
So it's actually, I'm using it a little bit loosely, I'm afraid, that I to a certain extent, I think now I'm wondering, I would go look up mythology, right? In the 19th century, there's a lot of interest in comparative stories, right? And I did a course this past winter, which also has a blog. I have lots of blogs. This one's called Speculum Aureum, and it was a blog for a course I did on medieval Christian mythology. But that was a bit of a tease because there's an early 20th century Protestant theologian, Rudolf Bultmann, who's very important for saying that Christianity needed to demythologize itself, right? That there's all these elements in Christianity that are mythological and therefore impossible for modern Christians to believe. Things like heaven and hell, and angels, and even the resurrection, right? And that he's using mythology there in that sense of
Pejorative?
Well, yeah, the stories that religions tell that are based, the creation, the usual, every tradition quote has a creation myth kind of thing, rather than that Christianity has in its stories a description of a spiritual reality that we all can experience if we understand how to attend to it. I say without that story structure, Christianity doesn't make any sense, right? You need to understand what Christianity thinks about heaven. Why do we have this sense that there is another dimension or realm or reality that's somehow we have access to through how, right? And I actually talk a lot in my Mary and the Art of Prayer about the imagery of the temple and the way the temple functions as an analog for heaven in both ancient worship and medieval worship, so that you realize that you're often trying to think about realities metaphorically through the worship practices that people are involved in. But that's more where Tolkien was coming from when he was trying to revive a sense of mythology, fairy story as sort of robust, carrying robust ideas. Most of the time people think about mythology, they think of them as what you're sort of the simplified, not scientific explanations for stuff. And I have a different version of things.
Yeah, I remember I believe his name was David Mercanti, who did a book on folk tales and mythologies, where he said basically that like originally mythology was just sort of like a sort of genre, but Christians later on used it as more of a pejorative against pagans and their religions.
Okay, so what Bultmann does is basically say, call Christianity's bluff and say you've got it too. But yes, that the Christianity's gone through a lot of traumas itself in its own sense of the reality of its claims, and it ends up in that situation because it makes this powerful historical claim, right, that God entered into human history. And so if God enters into human history in AD 1, you can't think of the stories about the divine simply as things that happened in non-time or metaphorical or some other, it's like we claim that Jesus historically was God incarnate. That pushes that pushes against a lot of categories of reality that, for example, the story, well, I don't know. I mean, the pagans think of their gods as real. They are real. They act in the world, but they don't make any claim of them acting specifically historically in the way Christianity does. So it ends up that's why history and myth end up in tension there. But
yeah, they were intertwined.
This is as tricky as that nostalgia thing that you guys were asking.
Yeah, we asked the big ones here.
Good.
Yeah, but yeah, I definitely do see that with. But I remember how people get the misconceptions about myths, where they don't people get the ideas that myths are merely just they didn't know the scientific answer to something, so they just made up an answer. They were using it to just explain away something that they didn't know about. When many people, I refer back to Mercanti on this, where basically he says that they weren't so much trying to explain what they didn't know, they were trying to put an image on it. They were trying to, let's say, with Poseidon, they wanted, they weren't trying to explain the tides or the ocean or like that. They were trying to give a solid image to it.
Mm.
And with the Ares when they marched off to war, and Aphrodite to symbolize love, and so on and so on.
It can actually be very beautiful if you actually go, if you don't take ironclad literalism into these things and actually try to appreciate the style that they go for. It can be pretty lovely.
Yes, absolutely. I think so. You're thinking about them.
They think about them as sort of.
Pretending that they're pretending materialism is the only answer is the first gambit there, right? Saying the only reason people need myths is because they don't have the material answers, right? But what people are. We were talking before you started streaming about how that we live in clown world now, right? And I say one of the things that makes it feel sort of desperate and completely clownish is we have no transcendent referent for meaning anymore as a culture, right? And so everything just feels utterly absurd. There's nothing that you can, there's no there's no yardstick for things not being right or wrong. It's
culture is dying and people are becoming more superficial.
Did you hear that?
But you could say that.
Huh?
I said we have Trump.
Well, unfortunately, he's a little unpredictable. I mean, you could say he's unpredictable in good ways, right? But he's Trump is not God.
Despite evangelicals claiming that God speaks directly to him and he's a representative, even though he's no more of a godly president than I am a priest.
No, he's not God. But the thing is, he should, and no earth. This is the problem. We keep thinking about the ancient Romans, right?
This is kind of like Reagan back in the day, right?
As far as the ancient Romans were concerned, the emperors were divine, right? And that
so the Egyptians,
right? What Christianity understands is my kingdom is not of this world, right? There's no way that any, human institution, any human being, any, purely material structure is going to carry the divine, except for, I guess the host in the Eucharist. And that any human expecting it to do so is idolatry, and therefore very dangerous. Don't worship Trump or any other person, just Christ.
Yeah, I mean, it was always just funny. Like, I remember
render unto Caesar what is Caesar.
That's it. Yes.
Give to God what is God's.
I remember like another one that it's actually pretty funny that people, like Americans, I think, take for granted like how much of secularism, like what we call secularism, does have some origins in Christian philosophies such as Augustine and John Calvin. Because I remember, I believe with Augustine, it was the Tale of Two Worlds or something like that, or the
two cities.
Yeah, where he basically, I believe, laid out like two or three different areas of separating political and spiritual lives, and it was using the New Testament, the Gospels, as a reference point for it.
So you're actually right. You're exactly right that the idea of the secular is a completely Christian concept. And I spend a lot of time in my History of European Civilization sections showing them, because it's sort of like the first quarter is always, it's like Christian by, Christianity is always a part of the worldview. It's politics, it's economics, it's culture, it's all of the entire thought structure of the text that we keep reading. Is grounded in Christianity. And so we get to the modern period and they're all like, oh, this is good, we can stop reading about Christianity. I'm like, well, no, because European civilization is so deeply embedded in that vision of reality. Even when you get to where we are now with, I don't know, the EU, whatever it's doing, this secular vision, it's, as I've been saying, it's like, it's the material, it's assuming that the material is the only reality, but it's therefore always with this, it's just earth, not heaven as well. And that's what Augustine's two cities were, the city of God and the city of the world. And if you live only for the city of the world, you have the secular, right? So we're basically living in one of the cities rather than the other one, as Augustine pointed out. But that division is a Christian division, whereas other traditions don't see that separation. They don't necessarily have a sense, like, Buddhism doesn't see the material world as real, right? It's ultimately Maya, right?
It's all an illusion.
It's all an illusion. And Islam doesn't see a separation between, the law of the secular law and the religious law. There's only one law. Why would you have, secular civic rules that aren't also actually divinely ordained?
Oh, but haven't you heard the Christians had to steal off the Enlightenment thinkers before they calmed down?
You guys hang out with some really ill-informed people.
Yeah, sadly, being on the internet a lot will do that to you.
Well, somebody's got to do it.
This is true, and Christians do need to speak to the world and be able to witness.
I remember what's so funny. It's funny when you have people that are just so confident in themselves, but yet know so little. I remember what's funny about, I go on some atheist websites and they'll be making fun of Catholics and the whole Eucharist thing, and they'll make a point about somehow absurd. This is how they don't get it. And I said, have you ever read Aristotle? That might help you out a bit. Like accidents and substances, and they just all of a sudden you just hear them hissing. Like, you're asking me to read? I'm like, this is stuff that the Catholic Church has been figured out for about 1,000 years.
Yes, it's. I mean, I can't remember who said it to me, but most people's religious education stops if they have any. It's like religious education goes to like they're 12 or something, right? And so they have a 12, it's like anything else that you knew when you were 12, are you convinced that that level of sophistication is what you'd want to carry into the rest of your life? I mean, what were you when you were, prepubescent? And so they'll have a child's understanding of religion and an adult's understanding of everything else, and then therefore think religion is childish. It's like, no, it's as if you only ever read children's books and you never read anything more mature.
It's basically the psychology of anti-theists in particular. They most of them are former fundagelicals from the South that retain their psychology when they go to their atheism, and they're none the wiser.
So I've heard that. I don't have that much experience with evangelicals of that sort, although I grew up in the South and in the Southwest. And of course, it frustrates me to hear what they describe, because of course, it's not, as far as I know it, a very deeply rooted sense of Christianity.
Like Christians worship a sky daddy that was invented by Bronze Age sheep herders.
Goat herders.
Yeah, sheeps and goats, and the sky fairy. I've heard that the sky fairy is the appropriate word. So yeah, us and our sky fairy, right?
Well, I mean, what's funny is about this is like they always get it completely wrong. I'm like, they'll say it came from Bronze Age goat herders. I'm saying, even if it did, I mean, you do realize a lot of smart people herded goats, right?
Yeah, see if they can go tame a goat.
Please demonstrate how you're smarter than a goat herder.
I mean, that's the obvious opposite oddity is we at present sit on tens of thousands of years of civilization and development and ingenuity and invention, and how I've never invented anything. Have you? What have you? We've invented, maybe I've invented a few. I'm not sure I've invented anything, and the sense that we are now all cleverer than the people in the past. No, we are beneficiaries of their invention.
Like because you got an iPhone or an Android?
Yeah. I mean, obviously there are people alive now who are inventing things, but most of us don't invent anything. And to be not to understand. I mean, this is the image of the ages is, you imagine everyone living in mud huts. It's like,
yeah.
Have you been to Shot? Have you seen the cathedral? Do you know what it took to build those by hand?
Well, following the collapse of the Roman empires, they did kind of live in mud huts in the ruins of what were once great Roman cities.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it depends on where they were, obviously, and it's still, you see, say think about the jewelry that we have from what is even called the Dark Age. That's a fairly, like the Sutton Hoo burial. It's a fairly intense level of sophistication of artistry. Or the Book of Kells, right? The manuscripts that are made in that period. It's the same period in which you're developing, Carolingian law and commentaries on scripture. All of this, they're very, very smart people who have records of things that we can study. There's small populations, which is true. There's been terrible disruption of the economic structure and so forth. But to assume that people are simply stupid then is
it's a character.
The hubris of bidding.
I remember what was funny is that, like, I remember we went on Gothic cathedrals, but what's funny is that the term Gothic was actually originally an insult to the buildings, because
they're deplorables.
Yeah, it was funny. It's always funny when I mention people that, because a lot of people don't remember that. It's like, I believe it was during the Renaissance with the humanists where they called it Gothic because it wasn't like it wasn't like the ancient Greece buildings and how they did it.
Now I'm not exactly sure. I think it may be a little later than that, but yes, they're comparing. They think of what we now call Romanesque as better, right? Because they think it's more nearly to the classical models, and they don't like the more recent architecture. But compare anything any church made either in the Romanesque period or the Gothic period or the Baroque period to stuff now. We're proud of ourselves now architecturally.
Like why do you think it is
it's laughable?
Why do you think it is that most people barely ever hear about the Holy Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, which shined rather brightly compared to the so-called darkness of medieval Europe?
Well, in part because we are Anglophone, and so the stories that the most English-speaking people tell tend to be focused on England, and it was not part of the empire. It was part of the Roman Empire, and there were Romans in Britain, but England was never part of the Holy Roman Empire. It had obviously marriage relationships between the royal families, but partly it's because it's. I mean, we don't get enough history of even medieval England in the United States education now, but to a certain extent, because the political tradition that we are educated into isn't part of those.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, the level of historian knowledge in the United States is laughable. I think I heard one poll where they said they pulled 100 people and 40% of them didn't even know who the first president of the United States was.
That's awful. That's just awful.
We will lose our nation if we lose our history. That was the theme of the most recent episode I did for my unauthorized course. Although you have to subscribe to that channel to get it. So, but they're definitely worth it. And I have the study guide, so you can do more reading.
Send a link in the live in the group chat.
It's the blog for it is unauthorizedmedievalhistory.blogspot.com.
Oh, all right.
Just all one word .blogspot.com. Unauthorized medieval history, and the episode that I just recorded this week is on Bede and his history of the English, and what's important about it is showing the way in which he, writing the history of the English, in effect overwrites the history of the Britons to make them not significant, and they sort of vanish from our historical imagination of England. And it's to a large extent Bede's doing in his narration, but it's also the reality what happened when the Anglo-Saxons conquered the island. Yeah. So invasion can wipe out an entire narrative. And then Geoffrey of Monmouth tries to write the history of the kings of Britain. That's when he sort of invents King Arthur as the main character, and it's trying to recover a sense of dignity and nobility of this previous people's history over against the English who have now been conquered by the Normans. So the way that you lose sense of your own which people you belong to as the histories change is very important. So if we're not teaching students who the presidents were, basically, we'll lose that government.
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is whenever you say the Normans, I always keep thinking you're saying the Mormons.
Normans.
No, French Vikings.
I said, wait a minute, the Mormons conquered people?
Normans.
I thought the only place that Mormons conquered was Utah.
Yeah,
everybody should remember that 1066.
The descendants of French Vikings, if I remember.
Yes.
When you say invented King Arthur, you mean compiled him as a character based on numerous figures like Maximius and Artorius Castus and
no, invented.
Ambrosius.
I mean, the problem is he claims in the beginning to have been given an old manuscript, right? But as far as there being a King Arthur, Geoffrey's is the first account that we have, and so the exercise of trying to figure out who he could have been talking about, or Ambrosius Aurelianus or something like that. That the problem is the story that we have is the one that Geoffrey told, and this isn't in my episode that in the 12th century, in his own day, he has other historians, including William of Newborough, who's writing in York, near York, saying he made it all up because it's not in Bede, right? So it's the the problem of, our dependence for knowing what happened, it depends on the way people told it in the past. And of course, people telling it in the past have their own purposes for creating a sense of, well, I mean, one, just the story arc, but two, the sense of who we are in the telling of the story. Which nation are you talking about?
Yeah, like we kind of get the idea that he had fought Rome and then became emperor. That was kind of based on Maximus, maybe. But
I don't know who you're talking about. It's not in Gildas. It's Bede only mentions this Ambrosius Aurelianus. It's what happened was the Anglo-Saxons came in and wiped out the British, or pushed them into Wales.
Also, I found somewhere that the Knights of the Round Table may have been based on Charlemagne's paladins.
It's Geoffrey of Monmouth.
Yeah. Geoffrey.
Yeah, came up with a pretty good story though.
Yeah.
His version of Arthur is actually less interesting than the later ones. So yeah, I mean, you get it retold and improved and elaborated.
It's a character that developed over the ages.
It did, but I do a course on medieval England, and we read Bede and Geoffrey, but we also read Michael Wood has an excellent book on In Search of England, and he has a good chapter on the sort of exercise in trying to find Arthur. And it's interesting that even Arthur is British, right? The whole point of it is he's not English, so that the English spend the rest of their history trying to find this British king is kind of entertaining.
Romano-British, to be specific.
He's imaginary.
Yeah.
And don't you be telling me otherwise.
I came across your appearance on Missing the Mark when you're on his channel, and you were talking about movies set in the medieval period. What would be your favorites?
Knight's Tale is brilliant, and partly because it's purposefully anachronistic. Also, because it's a sport film, and I'm a fencer, and so I love the sort of psychology of how they get into winning the joust. And they did decent research on sort of what the competitions would be like, although technically what they're doing is it's late 15th century if you have the tilts and things like that.
Like when you think of it as time compression, you can have more fun with it.
Yeah, no, so Knight's Tale is one of my favorites. Most of the other films that I could think, Monty Python is actually very funny because their satire is brilliant, and they did know their medieval history perfectly. So the most significant thing that happens in Monty Python and the Holy Grail is at the end when the knights are supposed to be charging, and they don't have any horses, right? So they're just going to run down the hill.
They got arrested by the police.
The police come in, right? And that is in fact the way things change, right? You have, by the later Middle Ages, you have sort of basically city militia taking over, and there is the police are the city's military force, right? So it's a good joke on the end of the Middle Ages, right? That they all get arrested.
We're like that. That's how it ended, really?
Yeah, with urbanization. But the thing is, the urbanization is happening over the course of the Middle Ages. So that's my other thing. So you see the Gothic cathedrals, and they're very beautiful, and they're amazingly well built. If you actually could see medieval towns, you go to Bruges or York. These are sophisticated cities, right? They're small in comparison to modern cities, obviously, but they are they're magnificent structures of the time, and you'd say, how does anyone get the image of the Middle Ages as backward, right? It's like, which period are you thinking of?
Yeah.
I mean, the Middle Ages had much advancements, like let's say in horseshoes. They made great advancements in terms of transportation. That was a big thing that I learned first when I was going into my series on the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm.
They were, they made great strides in that the entire time when it came to things in mathematics and basically like in transportation, like with horseshoes. They were, yeah, I mean, they were really getting up there with yeah. That's why I think I don't get. That's why a lot of historians don't even call it the Dark Ages, really.
No, I mean, and the thing is, so there's a big fight, as you all may know, going on in medieval studies for what the Middle Ages are, and I mean, it's a pejorative term, right? It's the middle between antiquity and modernity, and it's considered a period because it's the one that the Protestants didn't want. So they see antiquity as the pure church, and they see the modern period as the recovery, and the Middle Ages are just the papal period where they want to forget and
Yeah,
claim
that's another myth that
it was all corrupt.
The church didn't really have much power until later.
We do not have time to go into all that, but it's a description of a European periodization, right? And many of my colleagues in medieval studies now have become interested in what they call the global Middle Ages, which I teach a course on medieval travelers, which was the very first course I ever designed as a graduate student back in the early 90s, because I was interested in the way in which Europeans describe the rest of Eurasia, because that has deep effects on how they think about what they're going to find when Columbus goes the other way. He's looking for Asia, right? He's looking for the Khan. He's looking. Yeah. He thinks he's finding the Indies, and yet calling other regions of Eurasia medieval. Well, like they're middle to what? Are you? It's like, are you going to tell the Chinese that they had the Middle Ages too? It's a sort of, it's like I study the Middle Ages in the sense that I study the history of Christianity, right? As far as I'm concerned, if you're studying the history of the 12th century in all of Eurasia, you're obviously crossing a lot of different sub-periodizations in different regional histories. It's a sort of convenience, and it's imposing a European periodization if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah, I'm actually myself, for a series I'm working on, I'm getting into the Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And, I got this new book. I'm actually on the second chapter. It's called The Enlightenment by Duranda Outram. I think it's also pretty good when it comes to, like, some of because I believe with people like Steven Pinker and a lot of atheists, they're really glorifying the Enlightenment, and they're not willing to see any of the bad sides of the Enlightenment. Which, like, for example, when you look at the Holocaust, for example, although of course there is many factors that go into that, I mean, it can't be denied that there is some Enlightenment philosophies that go on in there, because this is Germany.
The Enlightenment never really interested me that much. The Renaissance is far more exciting.
I'm now bored, but I'm bored by both of you.
And the scientific revolution.
Good grief. Well, what I tend to tell my students, and this is a serious joke, right? Is when does modern history begin?
Somewhere between the near the end of the 18th century with the French Revolution up until the Industrial Revolution and so on.
Trick. It begins with the invention of writing. I mean, if you think about how much time we're actually talking about in history, it's like 5,000 or 6,000 years. It's not very much, right? So that modern historians are telling the history of 200 years. You cannot understand what happened in those 200 years if you don't understand everything that came before, right? So ideally, at some point, you do both very, obviously history at the level of an event can be in a few years or a few months. History in, sort of a cultural change might be several hundred years, but history should be something that you're always thinking about on all of those different timescales. And there was a school of history in the early 20th century in France, which was Marxist leaning in certain ways that I don't fully appreciate, but the Annales school, right? And their great vocabulary was talking about the longue durée, the history that takes place over, sort of geographical time, right? And the kinds of changes that only take place as the landscape changes or not. But since, all of human history has taken place in, since the last ice age, right?
Yeah, rather short timing compared to the 200,000 years humans have evolved.
Exactly. So that we obsess on, we became modern 100 years ago. It's like, okay, certain structures that we live with are relatively new. Some other structures that we live with, institutional or political or linguistic, are somewhat older. Others are even older. Some of them are 2,000 years old. For example, our church.
And civilization itself came about in young Earth creationist time, the beginning of the world.
Well, that'll fit. It's the mention of cities at all is just astonishing, right? It's like art. I read I did some reading some years ago in sort of evolutionary psychology because I was interested, and there was one book that was quite thoughtful. I don't know how practical it was in its theorizing, but just on the invention of art out of nothing, right? It's like, at what point did some human being make art? And it was Stephen Mython who was the author, and I was saying, this is actually, it's like, this is a huge thing. I've got the manuscripts and cathedral and 15th century altarpiece, devotional image. These are, if you're arguing over how well crafted this is, you have to get from the Venus of Willendorf to that in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, and the cave.
But you have to get to the Venus of Willendorf at all, which is astonishing.
Do you take that as the first representation, one of the first representations of God, or just women that Cro-Magnon just carved out of to represent women?
I mean, that's why history begins. That's why writing is so important. It's the first evidence that we have of people's thoughts. Otherwise, you're making stuff up.
In interpreting their cave paintings on the walls and stuff like
right,
that.
And you have no idea.
Okay.
I mean, figuring out what things mean without written pointers.
We're nearing Q&A time. You got any more questions, Brass?
No, I'm pretty good. I actually liked going over a bunch of history. That's our thing here.
Yep. Okay. Read from the live chat for a while. Utopia Buster asks, isn't there research linking meditation to prayer?
That's too general a question to answer meaningfully. Get him to elaborate.
Well, he says, isn't there research linking meditation to prayer?
But that's yes. I mean, okay. So Guido the Carthusian, writing in the 12th century, has a sequence of activities that we usually point to as typical of medieval monasticism. You go from reading, Lectio. Sorry, now I've forgotten which one's which. Prayer is in there. Contemplatio, reading. Now I don't remember which order they come in. In medieval monastic understanding, contemplation is the highest, right? And so if he means by that meditation, then prayer is a step towards that, right? That you, in prayer, you're lifting the mind to God so as to be ultimately end up in contemplation. And as far as medieval monks were concerned, that you use reading to start. It's like you read the scriptures and you meditate on them. So it's Lectio, Meditatio, Oratio, Contemplatio. I'm going to be embarrassed because I've forgotten. That it's in medieval monastic practice, it's understood that there's a stepwise relationship, and that oratio is not necessarily the end point. I don't know whether that's what he meant.
Oh, UFO Talks asks, has Rachel Fulton Brown read historyforatheists.com? I love that blog.
Nope.
It's by an atheist that debunks atheist activists on their bad history.
Okay.
Everything from the Dark Ages to the Jesus never existing crap. Think of how much to like there.
Well, I mean, you just got to remember, obviously, Jesus was just an amalgamation of pagan deities.
Like King Arthur and Robin Hood.
Oh god. I remember. Any more You got any more questions with that engine?
Let's see. S.J. Thomason asks, does she think Christianity was a net positive on people?
Oh, yes. There's an excellent book that one of my friends, Jim Papandrea, just published on how Christianity saved civilization and can do so again. And he and his co-author, Mike Aquilea, point out that without Christianity, you don't have the sense of the dignity of the individual. You don't have families considered, I mean, the nuclear family as anything, but families as a place in which women, a very interesting chapter on the way in which you have to contrast pagan antiquity with Christianity, because Christianity is what drove out paganism. That in the Roman world, never mind partial birth abortion that we are arguing about right now. It's like the baby would be born and be placed on the ground. If the father doesn't pick it up, it's thrown on the dung heap, literally. And often girls were thrown away that way. So the valuing of both women and children is a direct result of Christianity.
So they became Democrats.
What?
So the pagans would have been Democrats.
Yeah, the Democrats basically are behaving like Roman pagans. Yes, that as we talked about before with the divinized emperors, that the Romans don't have any sense the God or the law or anything else, right? It's like if the emperor is divine, he's the law, and that the Christians have that sense that even the emperor has to be answerable to the bishop or to penance or to correction is extremely important. That they also talk about this image of God as love, that there is like a positive sort of force in caring for us and giving people hope. Christianity survives not because it overpowers pagan antiquity, but because it inspired people and gave them meaning.
Yeah, basically, Caesars and pharaohs had the divine right, so to say, to do whatever they want, whereas the medieval kings, the popes, the czars, all of them had to answer to God.
Right.
Which, I mean, it's good. I remember that people do get sort of confused about the idea of heresy, where they think a heresy was just a false belief. Although that's not really correct, because, like, at least in medieval times, in order for something to be classified as a heresy, for one, it would have to be a false belief, and it would have to be one that you continue to try to spread even after being corrected on it.
Yes.
And so, I mean, it wasn't just merely having a false belief. Usually, during that time, like, since people were generally illiterate and they didn't, like, they came to false beliefs just naturally, that was just sort of what they picked up. Generally,
no, don't go there. The clergy throughout the Middle Ages is very concerned with educating the laity, right? So literacy is not the primary problem there. I mean, the heresy as such, we don't have evidence for until in the West after the great councils and so forth. We don't have any evidence for it until around the 11th century, and it's clergy, people who have literacy, that are some of the primary agents of heresy. So it's not coming from being illiterate. The prime heresy in the 12th and 13th century is Catharism, which is, as far as, okay, my colleagues are in a kind of debate about whether it existed or not. They sometimes think that they invents it in order to have an opponent, but insofar as it does seem to have existed and not just be a political concern, it's an anti-material belief that all creation is evil, right? It's creation of the evil God, and it's best to be dead, and therefore the sort of purity, the concern for purity, is quite powerful. you mentioned the Inquisition, which is the subject of most people's fantasies. That Thomas Madden at St. Louis University has done some really excellent articles on the Spanish Inquisition, pointing out that if you wanted a fair trial for anything, you were much better off if you were brought before the Inquisition.
Oh, funny! Like I actually in my
courts.
I read his book on it.
Good.
And I actually based some of my series on his work. Funny enough, I actually managed to get into contact with him and get some clarification.
Oh, he's a good guy. He's very good. So, but the earlier Inquisition, the one that Dominicans helped staff in the 13th century, the point is they go around and question people, right? It's like the Dominicans were founded as a preaching order to help instruct people better. So the argument that heresy arises because people are ignorant, in fact, it's more often the reverse, that it arises when people like John Wycliffe, who's one of the famous English heretics, read the scriptures more carefully and decide that they know better how to interpret them than the tradition has.
Mm-hmm.
The Protestants, for example.
Oh yeah, I mean that the biggest heresies to the Catholics at the time.
That'll partially answer their question as to why the big bad church kept the Bible hidden away from ordinary people to prevent atheists when reading it.
They didn't. A, they didn't, and B, it's the people reading this, who are highly literate, like Luther, that create a lot of the problems.
What do you make of Luther as a Catholic?
What?
What do you make of Luther as a Catholic?
He was an overly scrupulous monk. He wanted to be perfect, and he found it. This is not entirely my reading. He found an enormous faith alone was necessary, because he tried to. He's sort of magical in his practice, right? That he would try to be the most perfect monk, and his confessor Staupitz kept, famously said, stop coming to me with all these, peccadillos. Come back with something real. That Luther would just like try. He's sort of obsessively perfectionist. So he flipped over to the other side with his insight that it's faith alone.
Okay. S.J. Thomason asks, does she think capitalism has benefited modern societies?
I think the Industrial Revolution has had both beneficial and unintended consequences. Is that what you mean?
I don't know. Let's see what it is.
Well, you just have to remember.
You just
have to remember Jesus was a socialist.
And
the most famous. I was just doing some footnoting for something else today, and reminding myself of this. The James Thompson is the most famous version of that. Jesus Christ, our great exemplar, and he claims that what kind of exemplar is. He's writing the late Victorian period. What kind of exemplar is Jesus? He never did anything. He never had a job. He never had a family. He's a bit of a bum. If you know more about Thompson, you're not necessarily as impressed, because Thompson was pretty sort of manic depressive and gloomy himself. Atheists don't seem to end up terrifically happy. I'd say Christians tend to have a lot more joy.
And Nietzsche realized, who we love, by the way, he realized the consequences of atheism and went insane.
Yeah, at least he was honest about it.
Well, there you go.
Just joking to our sober-minded atheist friends out there. Utopia Buster says, I don't think Roman pagans had difficulty identifying sex differences.
They have. They have the idea of. Hermaphrodites are real, right? There are actually people that are hermaphrodites. There's certainly. You'd be surprised, right? Of course, they practice a lot of homosexuality, sodomy.
Yeah, in Greece they bugger little boys.
Yeah.
I could make a joke there, but I'm not going to.
Let's not
go ahead. This is a politically incorrect channel.
No.
Okay. Um, S.J. Thomason says Christians helped found the universities.
Yes.
And she also says, I really like her. I'd like to ask her to come on my channel too. Craig
Send
Reed,
me
the
an
Christian.
email.
I was
Craig,
wondering, though,
Craig
did
Reed, the Christian response says, yeah, me too.
oh, didn't India have sort of like a school system like a university at the time?
I'm sorry, ask that again.
I was saying, didn't India like have a sort of school system like the universities?
I don't know. I
I,
don't know what their educational system was like. I mean, they're the Hindu society is very heavily class stratified, right? The castes, and that is different in Europe. The concern was to find the best scholars of the boys, right? And every thanks to various church councils, and particularly Lateran IV, we know that there are provisions made for poor scholars, right, to find the bright young men out of the parishes and send them on up. So one interesting thing about the medieval church is that it's the one. It's not the one. It's a good path for social mobility. Obviously not with families though, because they're not supposed to get married. But I don't know what sort of social effect the universities would have in India. That's the first thing that occurs to me to wonder about, because otherwise I think it's probably the Brahmin. But that's
What do you think, studying medieval period, what do you think was better for medieval Europe than somewhere like China around the same time? Medieval China.
well, when Marco Polo, when in the 13th century the Christians are able to travel across Asia, they're very impressed with China, right? That they say there's so many people there, it's so heavily populated. They're amazed, and it has great cities. That's the memory of China in the 13th century is what drove Columbus in the late 15th, early 16th century, right? That they're looking for the riches of the East. So the Europe is very conscious of itself as not the center of civilization.
well, I mean, just remember, man, Marco Polo never really went to China. He never mentioned the Great Wall
Or
Oh, he
chopsticks.
or the
right, but that's because he's with them. He's serving a Mongol Khan, so he's not going to mention the things that the Chinese themselves use.
yeah. I mean, there was actually a book on that it basically had the question of did Marco Polo actually go to China? I know the answer to that. Yes.
Also, apparently, he also introduced pasta and ice cream to Italy.
Well, yes, I still believe that. I don't know whether it's true or not.
Also about Columbus. What do you make about him? You get two totally different stories. You get the visionary hero who discovered America, then you get the genocidal maniac and slave owner.
The one I tend to concentrate on is the fiction that Washington Irving creates of him as confounding the doctors at Salamanca with his courage and mathematical knowledge, when in fact he was bad at math and just got lucky.
And to his dying day, he thought he landed in India or
right. And
Japan.
But the reason that he had so much trouble convincing anybody that it was possible is he calculated the size of the Earth and also the extent of Asia, so he thought the journey wouldn't be that long. That there was America to run into was really lucky for him, because this was otherwise a pretty far trip.
Well, I mean, technically, like people say that he never landed in America. I mean, technically, he did land in Puerto Rico.
I don't care about that.
And Haiti and San Salvador and Costa Rica.
So, right. I mean, we bounced around on a lot of topics here. One of the things that obviously happens after the Black Death is the European population that was most easily affected by it all dies. And so by the end of the 15th century, when Columbus sails, you have a European population that's been battered by diseases for centuries from all of Eurasia. And the great devastation that the Europeans bring when they land in the New World is the diseases.
And it was the contributions the Neanderthals have in our immune system that helped us withstand the Justinian and Black Plagues.
Well, half the population died.
Yeah, but those with a higher concentration of such DNA survived.
Yeah, but that's pretty long after the Neanderthals.
Yeah. This is part of our immune system in general. That, yeah.
Right, but the populations had been stressed by all of those diseases for generations and generations, and the ones that were in the Americas, having left Eurasia, but sometime before that.
Yeah.
Although yeah. So I don't know. Anyway, I'm getting a little tired.
Okay, we got two more questions.
Okay.
S.J. Thomason asks, can you ask her what she thinks of capitalism? Does she think Christianity and capitalism are compatible?
So I have been thinking actively about capitalism for a little bit, but I was reading Deirdre McCloskey's books and was greatly taken with them, and the sense that the bourgeoisie need particular virtues, and insofar as we think of as capitalism as virtuous, I'm sympathetic to McCloskey's argument. I think the strongest sort of Christian argument is George Gilder's in Wealth and Poverty, where he talks about if you want to be successful in capitalism in the sense of innovative and making things that people want to buy, you have to be able to think about the other. You have to be able to think about things people want or would like to have in their lives. If you're simply selfish, you don't get anything, right? So, for example, if you want to do a podcast that people are going to listen to, and maybe give you some kind of income from, you have to do it so that they enjoy it. You have to make something that people actually want. And it's curious that we think of capitalism as forcing people to want things that they don't really want. Most of what we spend our income on is housewares, domestic architecture, plumbing, electricity, right? And the best book for that is Bill Bryson's book on the home. If you want to know whether the Industrial Revolution ever did anything for you, read Bryson on your house. And then you'll realize that mainly what the Industrial Revolution brings is clothing and houses.
Okay, last question from Craig Reed, The Christian Response. Did she see the Seventh Seal, Ingmar Bergman?
I haven't in a long time. I don't remember it very well.
Okay.
Death, chess. But I should watch it again.
Okay. Well, she'll be wrapping up. Any closing thoughts and where the dear audience can find you?
So they can find me as Professor Rachel Fulton Brown on my homepage. And if you're hungry for more reading lists, I have syllabi for all of my courses posted there, all the ones that I've taught at the University of Chicago. I have my new online course, unauthorized medieval history.blogspot.com. And I have more reading lists there and episode guides for the videos if you're curious about what I've been talking about. And in my more sort of practical, spiritual self, I have my Fencing Bear at Prayer blog, where I've been writing about the culture wars in academia, and of course, my good friend Milo.
Okay.
I failed to bring up in this conversation. Sorry, you'll have to have me back.
Okay, this has been Rachel Fulton Brown. Go check her out, check out our books, and see you next time.
Thank you.